Hey, today we're going to replace the front fender on a Honda CBR 1000RR. This is a 2008 model. The first thing you want to do is remove both of your calipers. I'm hoping that you've already done this before. So I'm not going to go in depth with this. You're just going to remove the two 14mm bolts that hold both your calipers on. You're going to loosen the pinch bolts that keep your axle tight, and you're going to remove your front axle. If you have any questions how to do this, watch the end of the video where I put the front wheel on in reverse. This bike was crashed pretty hard, so that black fender's got to come off. Once you remove your axle bolt, you can push your axle through enough and see a hole in your axle, and you can stick something through there to help pull that axle out. Drop your wheel down. Always remember, your right spacer goes on the right side of the bike, your left spacer goes on the left side of the bike. Do not mix them up, or it will make putting the bike back together a headache. So do that with every bike that you work on with your spacers. Next, we're going to work on getting this fender off. There are only 4 bolts holding this fender on. Somebody in the past has already removed the clamps which hold the brake lines in place on the fender. I will be installing a new nut on the left side and a new screw on the right side. But first we need to get this old fender off. I bought a set of plastics off of eBay from a company called Octmart. The plastics look pretty good. They shipped them DHL. It took about 3 weeks to get to the US during coronavirus season. The box was extremely damaged, crushed when I got it. When I opened it up, the upper fairing and the gas tank were destroyed. The gas tank looked like this fender here. This fender's at least been down the road to get destroyed like this. But the gas tank had a big crack just like that right down the middle of it. So absolutely not usable, even though the paint was beautiful on it. So once we get this fender off, we have to pull the hardware off of this fender. So you're going to want those little rubber grommets. You're going to want the metal spacers that are inside those rubber grommets. And you're going to want the 2 little pieces of hardware that are pop riveted onto the fender to hold your brake lines into place. So there's a few scratches on this fender, which is, kind of alright. For the price of what Chinese plastics cost, I guess you have to expect that when they get to the US. But this is the fender with all the hardware installed on it. You see the grommets and you see the brackets which hold your brake lines in place. So putting this on, I found that it was a little bit dangerous with these brake calipers in the way, so I'm just going to go ahead and zip tie them up to the levers on the handlebars, and that'll keep those brake calipers from bouncing into this fender while I'm installing it. I really don't want to chip any of the paint off of this new fender. So with these brake calipers up out of the way, now this fender will slide right into place. So unfortunately, whoever had the bike apart before I got a hold of it, they lost the metal spacers that went into rear holes, but that's all right. I have a kit with some little plastic spacers that I stuck in there. I'm more than positive that the little plastic ones will hold for the lifetime of this bike. I have the metal ones up front. The front's really what's going to take the most punishment with rocks and stones and whatever else, wind pushing against it going down the highway. So it's always best when you're putting a bike together that's been in a pretty bad accident to always use the OEM screws, nuts, bolts as much as possible. I'm not a real big fan of the aftermarket screw kits. The screws just aren't the same. The grommets aren't the same. The mounting hardware's just different. So what I like to do is jump on eBay and I look for nuts and bolts and screws off of crashed bikes that have been dismantled, recycled, and buy at least 2 kits for the bike that I'm building. Usually it sets me back about $50, but that $50 saves a lot of headaches when you have to line things up and you're missing brackets or screws or something that just makes it a little bit more difficult to put the bike together. So once you have the actual OEM hardware, the bike goes together much better. As you can see on the Fender, I took the hardware off of the original Fender, and it was basically just drilling out the pop rivet that held the metal bracket to the inside of the Fender, and then taking a new pop rivet and riveting it onto the new Fender. You want to move this hardware to the new Fender to protect both the bike and the brake line from any kind of damage. I imagine there's 2 holes there there's actually 3 holes in the new Fender, and it would be easy enough for you to just throw a zip tie through that. But you and I both know that zip ties on your bike that you want to have near show quality, you don't really want to have a ton of zip ties out in the open that people can see. Zip ties just don't make a bike look that great. So now we're getting ready to put the front wheel on. I get the question all the time, what grease do I use on my axle? So this is Lubramatic marine grease. Remember, your wheel does not turn on the axle. The axle just holds your wheel in place on the front of the bike. Your wheel turns on the bearings. You do not need a high performance grease that's going to break down when it gets wet or moisture gets introduced to it on your axle. You want a good lubricant grease like marine grease on your axle and in your wheel seals to keep the moisture out. If it's good enough to lubricate the bearings on your boat trailer, it's going to be more than good enough to protect your axle. Remember, the only reason we're greasing up the axle is to make it easier to pull that axle out next time. So don't think that you're doing yourself a favor by not putting grease on this axle. If I were to not put grease on this axle and just slide it into the bike and put the bike together, after 1,500 miles, when this guy brings his bike back to me for a new set of tires, it's going to be almost impossible for me to get that axle out easily without pulling out a BFH and beating the crap out of that axle to get it to slide from the bike. So do yourself a favor, a container of this Lubramatic marine grease is about $10. You can pick it up from pretty much any boat store. If you have a boat marine store, a marina, anything like that in your area that sells boat products, they're going to have Lubrimatic marine grease on the shelf. If not, you can pick it up online for $10 shipped to your house. So we just line up the wheel with the forks, and then we just push our axle all the way through. We install our axle bolt. Once we get the axle bolt snug, we're going to take a 22mm wrench and we're going to put it on this axle bolt. And then I have a hex tool. I get the question a lot, where did I get my hex tool from? This hex tool came off eBay. It was, I believe, $10. Again, $10, free shipping. So I put my torque wrench on the hex tool, and I put a 22mm on the axle bolt, and then I just tighten it down until my torque wrench clicks. So you hear it click a second time to make sure. So I know that my axle has been torqued to the correct torque specifications. Please do get out your owner's manual or your shop service manual to get your torque specifications. I am not going to give them to you. When you do your front forks at least 3 times as far as torquing down these pinch bolts. You want to bounce from side to side. You'll find that when you do the right pinch bolt and then go to the left pinch bolt on the same fork, once you tighten down the left one, the right one is going to need to be torqued down again, and then the left one will need to be torqued down again, and then the right one will need to be torqued down again, and then the left one should be pretty close to being accurate. So you should always, if you are working on a fork that has 2 of these pinch bolts, you should always go from one to the other, back to the first one, to the second one, back to the first one, to the second one, until you have perfect torque on both bolts. Then you'll know that this part is torqued down and it's going to function properly and not kill the guy who's you're putting this bike together for. So here we are putting on the right side caliper. We're just tightening down these 14mm bolts. Again, I don't give torque specifications. This is a 2008 model year. Sometimes torque specs change from year to year. So I don't want to be the guy who you flame on the interwebs because I gave you wrong torque specs. I prefer if you go out and research this yourself and find out the torque specs for your particular bike. Once you get your torque specs for your bike, make a Word document on your computer. You know, print it out, whatever. Tape it to your toolbox, somewhere where you can get to it easily. That way you don't have to keep going back to the internet every time that you do a service on your bike. So the right side is torqued down. Now we have a little clamp that we're going to put on to the braided brake line to hold it into place. I'm not sure why Honda used 2 different products on this bike. This side takes a 10mm cap bolt that screws into the fender, and the other side takes a 10mm cap nut. I guess it was 2 different engineers who did the fender. One guy did one side, one guy did the other. Neither of them compared notes. Either that or they're just trying to sell more parts in the future. I don't know. So now we're on the left side. We've got our 14mm socket on our caliper, and we're just going to tighten it down. Once we get it tight, we're going to go ahead and put our torque wrench on it and finish it off. And now that we've got our calipers torqued down, now we need to make sure the wheel turns freely, and then we need to pull our brake lever and pump up the brakes to make sure that when this thing goes out on the highway, it has brakes on it. So we're putting on our little clamp to hold our brake line in place. Again, this one has a 10mm cap nut that holds it on. It has a little stud that comes out of the fender. So once you get your brake line in place, make sure that there's enough play on these brake lines so the bars and everything turn freely. So that looks pretty good. Just going to make sure that's tight again, and then let's go ahead and make sure our wheel turns. So this blue really looks great on the front of this bike. And then let's pump up the brakes. And now let's spin the wheel and hit the brakes, make sure it stops. So we're good to go. This bike will be safe when it gets out on the highway. And I have ridden this bike since I did this video, and it does ride pretty good. Thanks for watching. I hope this helps.